Hello everybody, and welcome to the presentation. So glad that you can join us. I want to begin by giving honor to everyone who's been involved in celebrating emancipation in years past. We certainly have a long history of great emancipation celebrations here in Canada throughout the decades, throughout the last couple of centuries, in fact. And I especially will be focusing this day on the work of the great Mr. Emancipation, Walter Perry, and the British American Association of Colored Brethren, who were his organization, which were responsible for so many amazing emancipation celebrations here in Windsor from the 1930s right into the late 1960s. So even for those of us who were born before the heyday or after the heyday of Windsor emancipation celebrations, it's a legendary festival that we heard so much about through the years, and something about which anyone of African descent who has grown up in Windsor has surely heard again and again, as have many other people. When I talk to folks of all ethnocultural backgrounds who were around Windsor in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, they often call attention to the amazing celebration that was Emancipation every 1st of August weekend for years. So I've spent some time researching Windsor's Emancipation celebration, and I find that people often refer to the fun and entertaining aspects of Emancipation, the parades, the Midway Carnival, the great Miss Sepia pageant, which was not merely a beauty contest, but one that really looked for Black excellence among young women of African descent, and the talent shows and the competitions, and of course the famous barbecue pit, all aspects of a truly marvelous social event. And those were all really important, and they played an incredible role in the lives of many individuals and families, especially those families that gathered from both sides of the borders for a true transnational family celebration experience. People of African descent from Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Pennsylvania, New York State, and farther afield, Wisconsin, and so on, who were coming together in Windsor and Essex County to celebrate emancipation and to honor the legacy of their African Canadian ancestors, to honor the concept of freedom itself, and to celebrate that wonderful spirit of togetherness, unity, and hope and optimism. But emancipation in Windsor went actually far beyond that. Often the things that people remember are the fun things, and those are important. Those hold a very special place in people's hearts. And celebrating Black joy was and is an important endeavor. But there were serious elements and a serious purpose, and it's good to reflect on those as well. More about the intent and the philosophy that underlay the Emancipation celebration every year. More about what it was intended to accomplish from a social justice perspective. It was not merely a big party that went over the course of 3 days every year. It was something that was intended to promote Black success and progress, and to celebrate Black excellence, and to show us in the light in which we deserve to be shown. So I'd like to take a look today at the methods through which that occurred over the years, and then fast forward a bit to today's situation and how emancipation and why emancipation matters today. So a lot of people in the Windsor area, the Windsor region, associate emancipation rightly with people like Walter Perry, Mr. Emancipation, and the British American Association of Colored Brothers, the BAACB. That was a nonprofit organization that was formed specifically to operate the Emancipation Festival in Windsor. And it was a board that went on for a number of decades. That group of organizers has become synonymous with emancipation in Windsor in many people's minds, but the truth is that for years before the BAACB was formed, emancipation had been commemorated with observances by Black communities here in Windsor and Essex County and throughout Canada, including Amherstburg, Sandwich, Windsor, Chatham, Dresden, London, Norwich, Owen Sound, Brantford, Hamilton, Niagara, St. Catharines, Toronto, Montreal, Victoria, Halifax, and Sydney, Nova Scotia. Emancipation festivals happen in all of those places. In the 19th century, wherever Black people existed in Canada, they felt compelled to commemorate the day. August 1st, when slavery was abolished across the British Empire in 1834. Of course, we know that today the celebration continues very successfully in Owen Sound, although it will be virtual this year due to the pandemic, and it's being revived in many other cities. It's also taken a different form in Toronto due to the influx of large masses of our Caribbean Canadian brothers and sisters who have transformed it into the very successful Toronto Caribbean Festival, which is also canceled this year. But it's still celebrating the same historic event, the abolition of slavery across the British Empire, a very important date, August 1st, 1834. There are very few records relating to Windsor's celebrations in the 19th century, but it is clear that Windsor's emancipation celebrations had ceased by the end of the 1890s in a big way. They weren't really to be revived again in their original format or their original level of excellence until the 1930s. Locally, the emancipation celebrations at the Old Lagoon in Sandwich were the most notorious, successful if judged by the number of people they attracted, but simultaneously frowned upon because of the drinking and gambling which typified them. By 1912, Black ministers from Windsor, Amherstburg, and even Detroit were petitioning the Sandwich Town Council to actually put an end to the emancipation celebrations there because they had degenerated into a day of debauchery and gambling, apparently. It is a matter of record that these unorganized celebrations were an excuse for brawling, drinking, gambling, that when the celebration was done, the jails were full, said Walter Perry. There was little thought of dignity or prayerful thanksgiving, of concrete demonstration of the accomplishments of our race. This is what Walter Perry wrote in 1948. Part of me, I must confess, is a little sorry that I missed that. Sounds interesting. But the last of those sandwich celebrations was held in 1915. So the British American Association of Colored Brothers was formed in 1935 in Windsor, Ontario, for the purpose of creating an appropriate annual commemoration of Emancipation Day. The name itself, the name of the organization, British American Association of Colored Brothers, celebrates the transnational nature of people of African descent and their connection across borders. And so in the 1930s, Walter Perry, William Perry, D. Darby, Charles Lawson, A.J. Harvey, Clarence Carter, and Jesse Lagrasti formed this group. Later, in 1948, Walter Perry wrote retroactively that a group of forward-thinking colored men and women of Detroit and Windsor met in 1935 to form the BAACB, through which it would plan an emancipation celebration which would be a credit to the race. Uplifting the community of African descent on both sides of the border was what the emancipation celebrations of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s were really all about. And so the objects were, officially, to assist in developing the interests of the Negro, as that was the terminology of the time, including the promotion of amicable relations and understanding between them and other races and within our race, and without restricting and in furtherance of the objects aforesaid, to provide recreation, amusement, entertainment, athletics, and educational facilities and benefits, to print, publish, sell, and distribute literature, to collect monies by way of donations or otherwise to accept gifts, legacies, devices, and bequests, and to hold, invest, expend, or deal with the same, a whole lot of legalese, and to conduct an annual festival in celebration of Emancipation Day, and to import, export, buy, sell, and deal in goods, wares, and merchandise pertaining thereto. And quite a business endeavor it became. So a little bit about Walter Perry. You can learn a lot more about him in Preston Chase's upcoming fabulous emancipation documentary called Mr. Emancipation. But Walter Perry had been born in Chatham Township in 1899, and he moved to Windsor with his mother in 1907 after the death of his father. He, his mother, and his 6 siblings resided at 789 Mercer Street. He attended Mercer Street School and then Windsor Collegiate, later known as Patterson Collegiate and now known as Food Basics. He did not finish high school as he needed to help support his family. He had been a paper boy, and ultimately Walter Perry, always entrepreneurial, sold newspapers full-time throughout his adulthood. First at the corner of Olette and what is now Riverside, to passengers on the Detroit River ferries, and later to commuters at the entrance of the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel. He began as one of the founders of the BAACB, working with the festival on a voluntary basis, and ultimately he became the manager, which was a paid position. Russell Small, who was the grandfather of a very great friend of mine, Kimberly Simmons, was the president from 1946 until 1957, and he's also a very key part of the story of the glory of Windsor's emancipation. So there were a lot of things that I'm going to touch on in terms of the importance of this celebration. I think it's important to kind of talk a little bit about what happened to the celebration before we focus on all of the good things that happened. Despite the best efforts of everybody, despite everybody's entrepreneurial spirit and optimism, as of May 1958, the BAACB was carrying a debt of approximately $6,100 from previous Emancipation Day celebrations, mainly due to the rain in 1956 and the destruction of the Jackson Park grandstand, the very famous grandstand and bandshell, by fire in 1957. And unfortunately, when the Detroit uprising happened in 1967, it led the people of the city of Windsor, the municipal authorities that is, to perceive that it was dangerous or risky to have too many people of African descent gathering together, and that really became the beginning of the end of the emancipation celebrations as they had been known. They were no longer able to be held in Jackson Park. They eventually got moved over to Micmac Park on the west side and never really regained their strength. But let's pivot from that sad part of the tale and move on to the glory days of emancipation. The Entertainment Committee of Emancipation was the part that really a lot of people remembered. It was responsible for the parade, the entertainment programs, wonderful bands and musicians coming in from all over North America to entertain these crowds of hundreds or thousands from the American Midwest and Canada. Guest speakers, we'll get to that in a minute, always a religious program, a very wonderful, inspiring religious program, the annual Miss Sepia Beauty Contest, midway activities, Freedom Awards, we'll talk about that in a moment too, and of course, the whole staging of the festival. In the 1950s and 1960s, Freedom Awards were awarded annually to individuals, both black and white. They were a sign of the true intent of emancipation. Local winners of African descent ranged from Alton Parker, Windsor police detective and Canada's first black detective, and George McCurdy, deputy reeve of Amherstburg, to Henry D. Taylor, chair of the Windsor Board of Education and longtime activist. Award recipients also included people of European descent, like Walter Reuther, the legendary president of the United Auto Workers, and a variety of white business leaders, both American and Canadian, who had shown a particular commitment to the hiring and promotion of people of African descent. Progress was the annual publication of the Emancipation Festival. Much more than a program or just a schedule of events, it was really an editorial that gives us a glimpse year to year of how the Black community in Windsor and environs was doing. It included information about the guest speakers and performers who would be featured at each year's festival, biographical sketches about successful people of African descent, and commentaries on contemporary Black life, some serious, some humorous. Often it included an editorial piece by Walter Perry himself. In 1945, the great Adam Clayton Powell spoke to a crowd that was estimated at 30,000 at Windsor's emancipation. Think about 1945 and what would have been happening in August 1945 and understand why it was that Adam Clayton Powell said in that moment to the crowd that the true VE Day will come in the United States and Canada when we celebrate equality of the races. We march towards a second emancipation. In 1941, backing it up a few years, Walter Perry had begun to include an editorial written by himself in every annual progress program of the emancipation. So in 1941, he wrote exuberantly, "White men and colored men live side by side in peace and happiness. In Canada and the United States, there is no thought that any race of men may be bought and bartered like cattle. The future of the colored man is brighter now than it has ever been. We have our doctors, lawyers, actors, scientists, journalists. In every profession, we have leaders who rank with the leaders of any race. Speaking of the Second World War, which was then underway, he wrote, "These are dark days." But we knew dark days 100 years ago when we had no freedom. Interesting how he's presenting the history of people of African descent in contrast to the history of North America in general in fighting this war, and seeking some bridge building there. In 1944, Walter Perry wrote about Black military participation in the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, the Boer War, World War I, and World War II. He stated, "When the day has come, we hope that the sacrifice of white and colored blood will be remembered, that white men and Negroes will go on living in harmony and equality just as they fought in equality and died for that cause and were buried in common graves." In 1946, with the war coming to an end, he wrote, "The colored race is now coming into its complete freedom. For most of the past 115 years, we were domestics or laborers. Today, we are working in harmony with our white brothers, matching them in many fields, surpassing them in others. Privileges of higher education are ours for the asking. In medicine, music, science, industry, business professions, the world of entertainment, sports, color no longer stands in the way of success." Of course, reading this so many years later, we know that color continued to stand in the way of success. But how exciting that he viewed the world of that moment with such enthusiasm and optimism. In 1948, the BAACP wrote that all of us look to a brighter future and are living today in an era which finds us accepted for our qualities as citizens, as men and women with a contribution to make to our country. 1948 was the first year in which Emancipation became a 3-day festival in Windsor. And Perry stated in that 1948 edition of Progress that the leading speakers of our race have been engaged for the observation of emancipation. These leading speakers included Congressman Adam Clayton Powell of New York, Dr. William Holmes Borders of the Wheat Street Baptist Church in Atlanta, Reverend Robert Bradby of Detroit, and Chicago famed city councilor A.J. Carey. Perry went on to say, "In such a short time, no race in the history of the world has come so far, a tribute to the same indomitable spirit which made the slaves sing and pray when going was the hardest, which caused them to dance in the dark. Yes, we have accomplished much. To our race belong proudly many of the world's greatest entertainers, scientists, educators, politicians, doctors, businessmen, ministers, and publishers." By 1949, Perry was calling Windsor's Emancipation celebration the greatest freedom show on earth. And in the 1949 Progress magazine, he described emancipation as an event which was the greatest single Canadian or American step towards national democracy. He was clearly, by this point, emphasizing intercultural relations. At no other place on earth, we are convinced, could so many peoples of divergent colors and faiths and customs meet, rub shoulders, and have fun together without one single instance of discord. By 1950, the BAACB began to rent offices at 55 London Street West, which is now University West in Windsor. In 1953, Perry wrote in Progress, "Each year, we issue a call to men of good faith to join the crusade of interracial understanding. Answer this call not by word of mouth, not by loud and lavish display, but by your actions in your day-to-day living." He added, "We like to think these celebrations have helped in some small way. It is our aim and ambition to show our people in the light in which they deserve to be shown, as an enlightened, advanced, educated, thinking, progressive, patriotic people." In 1954, the Emancipation celebration also acknowledged Windsor's 100th anniversary. The speakers that year were very special. They included the National Council of Negro Women founder Mary McLeod Bethune, former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, and the great entertainer W.C. Handy. In her speech, Mary McLeod Bethune said, "We must do away with everything like segregation and discrimination. However, this can't come about by legislation alone. Something must happen in the hearts of men. This is no time to look at color. We must look only at humankind. In her 1954 speech, Eleanor Roosevelt said, "We must establish here a real brotherhood among our own people, teaching the rest of the world by example, and so help this wave of freedom now sweeping the world." Such beautiful aspirational words. By 1955, Perry was writing in Progress that city officials were stating they did not intend to hire people of African descent. And so he wrote, "We now call upon Mayor Patrick to set this to right, or to be classified with those of their ilk as destined for political oblivion. Mr. Patrick, may I suggest that you make an example of these men, let them go." He was speaking of those who were committing discrimination and racist hiring practices. And he went on to say, "May we remind you that no percentages were used in recruiting our boys in the last war," speaking of the Second World War. "All, as veterans, should remember this. In the First World War, I would like to remind them that the No. 2 Battalion was all Negro and helped preserve the democracy that these city managers seem to have so well forgotten." "One thing is for certain," he wrote, "the British American Association of Colored Brothers will not stand idly by and watch the humanitarian work of the past decade undone by a sloppy stroke of a pen operated by a weak wrist." While mayor of this city, Mr. Arthur Ream was responsible for placement of the first colored policeman in uniform and the later addition of 3 more. He spearheaded the appointment of James Watson to the position of city councilor, city solicitor. Pat Watkins became sanitation inspector through Mr. Ream. Charles Knoll was named clerk of skill in the work department. McEwen Rock was named to the water division. Thomas Milburn joined the hydro. Contrast this treatment with the sudden chill which seems to have descended on our civic administration. So you see that at that moment in the mid-50s, right around the time when the civil rights movement here and in Canada are really reaching a fever pitch, the emancipation celebrations are also being used to call attention to wrongs that are being committed against people of African descent and to seek some changes. And that's a really important point. In 1956, Martin Luther King Jr. was the keynote speaker. He said to the Windsor audience, "We have now seen the old world of political domination, economic exploitation, segregation of humiliation pass by." And he described the cries against the abolition of segregation as death groans of the old system. And he came actually twice to Windsor to be part of this festival. In 1961, Perry wrote, "Our weapons must be many and varied. Patience when patience is required, action when the pace is too slow, understanding and mutual trust, intelligence and foresight." In 1957, something very sad happened. Days before the Emancipation celebration was to begin, the Jackson Park grandstand burned down mysteriously. It is said that the fire hydrants did not work, so firefighters could do nothing for at least the first 40 minutes. And then, not unrelated, in the 1959 Progress magazine, Perry is explaining the financial situation that the festival had been experiencing due to the rains of 1956 and the grandstand fire of 1957. Those were really the beginning of very hard times for the Emancipation celebrations in Windsor. Later, in an article in 1959 in Progress, Perry urged readers to support Black businesses. He said, "Next time you go out to purchase a loaf of bread, a new dress, a new suit, or whatever it may be, remember the Negro businessman can help you, and more important, you can help him. Sure, you can get things at a store that is closer and more convenient, but remember your patronage of our business establishments will help stimulate the economic progress of the Negro people, and the future depends on the economic well-being of the entire race. 1 week of support is not enough. 52 weeks of support from every Negro citizen are needed to give the Negro businessman the strength he requires to compete on the open market." The 1963 issue of Progress presented an article comparing and contrasting the missions and objectives of the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, and SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So there were a great number of endeavors in terms of the political discussion that happened during emancipation to kind of advance the cause of people of African descent. And that was actually heightened by bringing in speakers from pretty far away to come and inspire and motivate local people of African descent and to engage in conversations that would help to garner support for endeavors that were happening in the United States as well. Those were very important transnational conversations that were a key part of emancipation every year. So one of the things that we know is that there were many incredible speakers that came. We often talk about or hear about Martin Luther King being here, and we often see the picture of Mary McLeod Bethune. But keep in mind that there were also people like Reverend Robert Bradby, a very significant pastor and activist from Detroit, Reverend Dr. William Holmes Borders from Atlanta. There was Bishop George W. Baber, the AME bishop from South Africa, who was here for emancipation. The Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr., Congressman, New York, and pastor at Abyssinia Baptist Church. There was the incredible Reverend Archibald J. Carey, attorney, alderman, and pastor in Chicago and member of the National Board of the NAACP. There were also local speakers like Dr. Roy Perry, one of our early 20th century Black city councilors, certainly not the first, that was James L. Dunn, but there was Roy Perry, who I believe was the fourth Black city councilor in Windsor, and James Watson, our very first Black city solicitor and the first Black city solicitor in all of Canada. We also heard from the Honorable Paul Martin, MP, and Mr. David Kroll, MP, as keynote speakers through the years. And there were very interesting speakers from the South, such as the amazing mentor of Dr. Martin Luther King, Benjamin Mays, president of Morehouse College. There was Lester B. Granger, executive director of the National Urban League, and Reverend Fred L. Shuttlesworth, president of the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights and lead organizer of the Birmingham, Alabama bus boycott, Benjamin Hooks, lawyer, Baptist minister, judge, and eventually executive director of the NAACP, Carl B. Stokes, first Black Democrat elected to the Ohio State Legislature and eventually the mayor of Cleveland, Reverend Wyatt T. Walker, executive assistant to Martin Luther King, and Reverend Dr. Ralph David Abernathy. So these are just a small sample of the amazing leaders from the community of African North American descent who came here and were part of these discussions, not just giving a speech, but engaging in discussions with local Black leaders right at the time when our own struggles for equal rights were really on the rise through organizations such as the Windsor Interracial Council or the Council on Group Relations, the Guardian Club, the Central Citizens Association, and others. So when you're thinking about the past of emancipation in Windsor, I invite you not only to focus on the fun stuff, which is lots of fun to consider, the parades and the festival and the food and the talent competitions and amazing musicians and artists coming and being part of that festival. But keep in mind as well the whole situation of focusing on Black excellence and activism, and not only focusing on activism and social justice, but also highlighting people who were doing well in the community. Our first group of Black nurses, our first Black lawyers in the area, our first Black elected officials since the Underground Railroad era, and highlighting those people and calling attention to them and using them as examples and role models to inspire others. It was an amazing festival in so many ways that went far beyond the party. I would invite you as well to consider what emancipation means today. As you may know, there is a motion in progress to have Emancipation Day recognized federally, not as a statutory holiday or as a paid holiday, but as something that is given federal recognition to call attention to the history of peoples of African descent here in Canada and to focus on not only Black history, but the Black future. There are also many measures underway to help boost the level of Black history and content in the curriculum in our province and many others. I would invite you to support those and also just to avail yourself of the upcoming events, both face-to-face and online, that are happening throughout this weekend. Emancipation is truly something for all of us to celebrate, and I hope that you will. Okay, let's take a look and see if there are any questions. Okay, I see there's a question about where copies of Progress could be found. There are certainly a great number of Progress copies available in the archives of the Essex County Black Historical Research Society, but the Amherstburg Freedom Museum also has quite a few copies of Progress on display at the museum this weekend in celebration of Emancipation Day. Because of the pandemic, visiting the museum is just by appointment only, so be sure to call them at 519-736-5433 to book your appointment if you want to go and see them. But they are once again open to the public, and that's very exciting. What other questions do we have here? Oh, there's a question about the book. So the book that I'm writing is called Our Own Two Hands, A History of Black Lives in Windsor and in Windsor from the 1700s forward. It's still in the revision phase. As soon as it is available, most likely next year, we'll definitely make sure everybody's aware and can get a copy. And just if you want to check the comments, please note that there is a link in the comments in the chat function to sign the petition for Emancipation Day. That is a petition that is being reviewed to have the House of Commons take a look at Emancipation Day and make it a federally recognized day. I see a question about how we can amplify the fight for inclusive curriculum change in the community and at the provincial level. That fight is really being spearheaded in our province, Ontario, by the Ontario Network of, I may be saying this wrong, but it's ONABSE, the Ontario Network of Black School Educators, and also by the Ontario Black History Society. So for sure, take a look at their respective pages and see how you can get involved. But it is a very good idea if you want to write as an individual, or if you're part of an organization or a group or an institution that wants to send a letter to the Premier or to the Minister of Education. While their focus is very much on the pandemic measures at the moment, it's still a good time to keep it on their radar that we do need to focus on boosting that curriculum about Black people and their history. And I believe that's all of the questions. Thank you so much, everyone, and happy Emancipation Weekend to all of you.